stand up.
Okay, thanks very much for our next 5-minute burst from Salford. We're very lucky to have Alan Taylor. He's going to be talking about the effects of centrifugal blowers and reservoir performance on organ pipe flutter. Okay, good. Thanks very much.
Alan, could you just click the mic on?
Sorry?
Click the mic on, please.
Bear with me.
Hope it's working.
Do you want me to do the honours?
Yeah.
I'll just put it on here. That's okay. And this, do you want to clip it around?
Yeah, stick it there.
Stick it in there. That's probably for the best. That'll be easier, won't it? Like that. Perfect.
Okay. The first question to ask, does organ pipe flutter exist? So I did a small pipe organ survey, and the organ builders were asked to look at 4 pipes at the soundboard and record whether they had flutter or not, and then listen to those pipes in the body of the church. And this is the basic results of that small survey. Yes, and it was confirmed 2 weeks ago when we had an IBO, an Institute of British Organ Building meeting, and unanimously they said organ pipe flutter exists. So 70% of the pipes had flutter at the soundboard and 50% in the body of a church. More important though is that 80% of the reservoirs were weighted, and you'll find out more about this shortly. Early pipe organ, the water was pressurised by a column of air, goes back more than 2,000 years. And on the right hand side you see the apparatus that was built by Hutchins, the Boston organ builder, for Sabine in his original experiments, and it uses the same principle, that there's a column of air, a column of water that is pressurised by the weights. Historically, organs were blown by feet or hand, so you see this early 1600 example, and then we go to the 1900, and this was the time when you can either hand blow them, or water engines were becoming popular. Growth of public utilities, water supplies. Then in the bottom you see the advent of the electric motor. It was connected to this 3-crank shaft, and it operated like a 3-cylinder car engine and kept the reservoir full of air. This is the start of electrically driven organ blowing with an early fan, 2 control valves, one control valve on the left hand side and another simple gate valve to the reservoir on the right hand side. And it was all controlled by this elegant control system at the bottom, so as there was enough wind, it moved the arm, it slowed the motor down, and as the reservoirs dropped, it speeded the motor up. This is my setup in the my works at Ramsbottom. 3 basic things: a reservoir, a pipe, connecting pipe, and a blower. That's 4 things. The pipe that we actually listen to with a microphone, and we look at the reservoir top vibration with an accelerometer. The reservoir can either be weighted or sprung. And this is what it looks like in real life. So you can see there's a reservoir, there's the pipe up there, there's a bit of this slide cut off. The accelerometer's on the top. This is measuring the air pressure in the pipe before the reservoir, and the pressure in. This is a throw over from a BS848 standard airway piece of equipment that we have there. And you can see I'm looking real time with a 01 dB symphony at the accelerometer and the pipe. This is the spectrum of this pipe, similar to what I'm using. To 20k, and you can see there's harmonic roughly every K. This is the zoom of the fundamental, and you can see that, and we're looking here at 2 conditions. 1 is hand blown, the old-fashioned way of doing it, and 2 is electrically blown, the modern way of doing it, and you can see there's a difference. that with the electrically blown, we've got these two side bands on each side of the harmonic at roughly the frequency that is the natural frequency of the reservoir, so that it's about 10 hertz. And if we look at it on the accelerometer, you can see that there's a big difference between a hand-blown system and an electrically blown system, that the hand-blown system is fairly flat and doesn't have any peaks or anything, but the electrically blown system has got this huge spike, about 10 hertz. So I tested 8 different fans and got 8 different results. The last test is in fact a garden leaf blower, so you can see how that performs with blowers that are built for the actual purpose of driving organs. So there's a huge difference there, and it's significant that one of the lowest, number 4, is a Taylor unit from organ builders in Leicester, which is a very primitive unit, box shape, and provided some really good results. So I'm looking at here what the reservoir is vibrating at 10 hertz. So I'm just looking at 10 hertz, and this is the results produced by 8 different blowers. So if you look at the difference that you get between a weighted and sprung reservoir, because it behaves like a mass spring unit, you can see that the weighted, you get this low frequency, about 10 hertz typically, and with a sprung you get a resonant frequency that's roughly twice that, about 18. And you can see that there's a big difference. And if you think about the psychoacoustics of this, up to about 15 hertz we're into kind of normal amplitude modulation, and then from about 15 to 300 hertz we're into this kind of roughness period, which peaks at about 70, that the ear is most sensitive to 70. And for the low frequency, the ear's generally most sensitive to about 4 hertz, and that's why fiddle players vibrate. They do the bravado around 4 to 7 hertz. So one of the ways of trying to mitigate is to tune the reservoir. So you can tune this mass spring system by throwing the weights off and increasing the springs. And you can see that there's 4 plots here. 100% weighted, blue, and we get the best results, the green, when we've got 73% of weights and the rest is springs. So we're moving the natural frequency along. And a weighted reservoir, as you vary the pressure, you vary the resonant frequency. With a sprung reservoir, once you've got the resonant frequency for the lid without any springs on, it stays the same. So you can change the pressure and you don't actually change the resonant frequency. Another alternative is to actually use an attenuator. This is an attenuator that I built. It was originally a postcard holder that had no further use, so we made this silencer out of it. Simple pepper pot in the middle surrounded by rock wool, and these are the results. So you can see that there's a substantial improvement in the amount of reservoir top vibration using an attenuator. Any questions?
What are your best solution? What did it sound like? Was there any sort of improvement?
My hearing's not the best in the world, but I'm told that it pretty well kills everything. Yeah. I mean, if you go into it in more detail, there's a significant difference between how an organ sounds with a sprung chet-regulated system to an old-fashioned organ that has a kind of completely weighted system. So usually when you listen to an organ, you can tell straight away whether it's electronic or a pipe organ. But the other thing that you can tend to tell when you've done a little bit of work about this is that whether the system's sprung or weighted.
Okay, any other questions?
You haven't got an example to play, have you?
Well, I didn't know what the playback was going to be like in here, so I didn't. So that's why I brought this. So this is indicative. And that's indicative of what it sounds like on the soundboard. They're quite loud. Well, you can see it was about 6 inches away from the pipe.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can you pull this thing up?
Yeah, I can, no problem. We have second or last student first. Sorry there, thanks very much. Which is Alex Wilson. And he'll be talking about the co-authorship and community structure in a university acoustics research centre.
Great.
Right, yeah. Clip that on, slip that in your pocket.
So you could probably guess which university-based acoustics research centre I was going to talk about. You'll find out. So the first thing we'll do is actually open this with Firefox. Okay, so there is a co-authorship graph of the Acoustics Research Centre in Salford. We'll go into this now in a bit more detail. It's basically a big social network, but now, right. That's fine. So normally my research areas are quite different to this, so I thought if we're going to have a talk about diverse range of work that's been done by people as they were students in this centre, then why not have a talk about the work itself on a meta level that has nothing to do with acoustics. So I'm interested in this case in network theory and graph theory. This is a directed graph of votes in the Eurovision Song Contest. Any of you who've ever watched Eurovision know already that the United Kingdom gives most of its votes to Ireland, gives a lot to Malta, and Scandinavian countries in general. Russia and Ukraine usually give votes to each other. That has not been the case lately. Cyprus and Greece regularly do. And there's reasons for this, and it's normally shared musical tastes, shared diaspora, political reasons and whatnot. But this forms as a map of how sort of knowledge is permeated and propagates through, well, Europe for the most part. The colors represent different communities. So an algorithm is used to kind of measure the inflow and outflow at each node and assign communities based on that. So I want to do this in the context of people, and my people were effectively current members of the Acoustics Research Centre here, and by extension anyone they've ever co-authored a paper with. So that includes most PhD students and some master students. Anyone here who maybe had in the past worked here or did a PhD here, you might be included. And then look at communities within that. So on our university's institutional repository, everybody's encouraged to upload the papers once published. And there's a convenient drop-down export button where you can basically take bibliographic data of an entire school or research center or the university as a whole. It's exported as one big file. And I already had a routine that would convert this type of file into the type of graph that we saw here before, a network graph. So I imagine other than maybe rail networks, road networks, people here probably haven't done too much network science, so I probably won't go into like the details of how this works and skip to, I guess, the conclusion, the answer. So this large graph here, each point represents somebody in that database, so mostly current staff, PhD students, both of those of the past, and external collaborators. And in total, there were 272 different authors found, which represent nearly 400 different papers or works. Generally, the size of the points here will represent sort of different measures of importance, but I won't go into that too much. A community detection algorithm identified 19 communities here. You can tweak that parameter and find more or less communities, but if we just look at a few in a bit more detail, and the aim of this is not to highlight anybody's contributions or embarrass them or praise them or any way, but down the bottom we kind of see one dense network, which I showed this to some of its contributors the other day, and they were able to tell me, yes, this is mostly coming from a large funded project a couple of years ago about railway noise and vibration, of which there were dozens of research outputs. So they're all here in this repository. If two people have authored a paper together, there's a link between them. So the thickness of line is proportional to the number of co-authored works between those people. So the idea was, if you did this before lunch, you can come up and try and find your own name and so on, but can't do that now. So a lot of this bottom half of the graph represents vibration and noise, environmental acoustics and vibroacoustics and these sort of related issues. The next largest group is sort of towards the top, and a lot of this strong connections in the middle is from another sort of large-scale project that went on a few years ago about audio quality and user-generated media. But kind of coming out then from each node, you see a person's large amount of PhD students. There's myself. And here's PhD students of this person and so on. And you also see other communities being formed in different regions. If they've collaborated less with the net collection of the department, they're further towards the outside. If we run the community detection algorithm again with a different resolution, we can break it down into 5 communities, which roughly kind of represent vibration, environmental acoustics, broadcast, soundscapes, metamaterials, and the largest group is the everything else group, which I guess is digital audio, spatial audio, psychoacoustics, archaeoacoustics, oralization, virtualization, lots of things that don't really fall into the other groups. So this was not the subject of my research, this was just something else I did as a hobby, but actually found a way into a paper recently where I took 20 years of conference proceedings in the Digital Audio Effects Conference and ran this routine on that. And the main connected part of it was 667 authors that were then divided into communities. In this case, with a more international group, most of the communities break down on the nation or a university. People tend to work with people close to them, but they also tend to migrate to those that are close to one another. Interesting points are ones that span between 2 groups, where someone might have done a PhD in one country, moved to a different country, worked with different people, is in the middle. And I sort of span this as not an overtly pro-European paper, but it was an interesting discussion afterwards. I submitted a paper as anyone else did, but there wasn't really a conference on digital audio effects, wasn't really a session for bibliometrics. So a session was created effectively, and I was asked by the organizers to contribute to a second paper, a second presentation about looking a little bit more at the representation of female researchers and potentially what is the proportion, why is it so small, and then how can we have a discussion on that, which was a very useful discussion that we had at this conference moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Any quick questions? We're beginning to slip on time a little bit, so I'm keen to keep flowing if that's okay.
What are you working on now?
Well, perception of audio quality in next generation audio reproduction systems. So effectively spatial audio, object-based audio. How do you compare systems in a fair way? Because everybody thinks their system is the best. How do you come up with new standards to truly compare them? In a nutshell.
Okay, thanks very much. If you want to unclip. And then, okay, it's all right. All right. Just clip that on and slip in your pocket, James. Okay, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, James Trow. He's going to be talking about airport infrastructure planning and noise. Thanks very much.
That's a bit of a big up. Great pleasure. Normally it's quite a reluctant. Anyway, I've been asked to give a bit of a talk about airport infrastructure planning and noise. There's a hell of a lot goes into this, as you'll see. So I've tried to keep the back end of this as niche as possible to some of the, shall we say, the more interesting bits of what's coming up in the UK over the next few years. I'll give you a bit of a guide as to what infrastructure planning components are for airports, how it all fits together, how it all links. Examples of the assessment considerations when the consenting process, particularly under nationally significant infrastructure projects. So that is runways and airspace, so I'm definitely going to touch on the sexy stuff whilst we're on this. And then an example of sort of the noise assessment information required and all the complexities that go with that. So this is actually Boris's failed Island of Grain airport. It might not be so failed. We're expecting another draft NPS maybe in the next few weeks. Let's see. And ultimately, if you're building a runway and you're building an airport, you obviously need the runways. That's part of the infrastructure, so where the aircraft have to land. Alongside all of that, we need the taxiways. That's where the aircraft move to and from the terminal buildings and the aprons, where they pick up the passengers, they offload the bags, they put the bags back on the plane and off they go. And then we have things such as MRO, it stands for maintenance, repair and overhaul. That's where the planes go to get fixed, serviced, get some pretty noisy activities happening in those facilities where engines are taken off aircraft or put in situ and they're run, tested at high power levels, making sure that they're sufficient for flight, air cabin pressurization tests. So discrete activities on the airfield itself that can produce quite a lot of high levels of short-term noise. Then surface access, everyone's got to get to the airport, they've got to leave the airport, they've got to go home or to their place of work or the business. So all of that goes into the mix as well. And then AAF, anybody who can knows what that means, I'll buy them a pint. I'll hang around and buy a pint. It stands for Airport Ancillary Functions. So that's all of the other things that you need to keep the airport functioning. So that's things like, where does the airport staff go to service the airport? So all of those people who go and clean it, where do they go? What about the hotels that the people stay in when they're going to the airport? What about the incinerator system that's got to burn all of the waste that comes from the aircraft? Those are all these things that you don't necessarily think about. And as you can see on this list grows, all the things that produce noise keeps getting more and more and more. And then finally, well, we can't have an airport unless we can fly the planes, and we need the airspace to do that. And that's the invisible infrastructure of all of this. So that's where they come off the runway as part of a departure, and where they fly to, and how do they land, and effectively all the routes that entails, who they're overflying. And ultimately, in a nutshell, that is what an airport looks like. Multiple noise sources, multiple considerations, and then finally all of the things that it affects the communities. So that's all of the residentials, that's all of your schools, that's all of your hospitals, and then habitats. There's biodiversity. That was one of the main reasons why Boris Island got binned, was because of the habitats assessment. And you've got big considerations like that on wildlife that has to be taken into account too. And then finally, which is not mentioned, there's open spaces, things like tranquility. What happens when people want to go out and have some recreational time? How does an airport affect that? So all this has to come in to one place. So if we look at the sources of assessments and the domains of assessments for an airport, they're kind of broken down into three. Certainly the noise generating aspects. We'll park noise receiving aspects for a bit. Surface access, so road traffic, that needs assessing. Heavy and light rail, there might be underground links to and from airports that get built. Air noise, the noise from the aircraft whilst they're in the sky in the landing and takeoff cycle. Ground noise, the aircraft moving around, the airside vehicles, all of the building services plant, hangars and maintenance, all of that. These are all different sources. They all have different assessment methodologies. If someone came to you and said, we're going to assess a road scheme, that's different naturally to how you would assess the noise from an aircraft in the sky, both in the way you calculate the noise, the way you assess the noise, and the methods and the policies and the guidance that you would follow. And then potentially different consenting regimes. So consenting an airport, where you need to consent a road, there's a different consenting policy that gets you the road rather than the airport. So these are all different things you've got to juggle up when you're talking about airport infrastructure. So where does that leave us? Well, airport development's consequential. Now that's me trying to juggle this up a bit, but what it means is, if you have one little thing that changes the airport, or you go and seek planning permission for one thing, there's likely to be a whole succession of things that change as a consequence. So for example, if you try and relax, say, night restrictions, try and fly more aircraft at night, that will inevitably lead to you generating more cars at night. That will inevitably lead to you actually generating more aircraft during the day as well, because the airlines will be able to store their aircraft at the airport overnight to facilitate more daytime movements. And what that means is, one assessment of an airport development is never just the assessment of the thing that you're going for permission of. It's always a succession of assessments that relate to that thing that you're actually trying to assess. And that means that even a relatively minor development can lead to some comprehensive assessment work. Airport is always schedule on development in the EIA regs. That means that we've got to try and disprove significant effects associated with an airport development, otherwise it's EIA. And EIA is pretty much automatic. There was one project I worked on last year where we were reducing noise from a certain airport activity by 5-6 decibels, wholesale. We got a QC opinion, said, this can't be significant. And the QC opinion came back and said, it's significant because the EIA regs do not differentiate between beneficial or adverse significance. Even if it's a beneficially significant effect, it is still EIA. About 3 cases of that in the UK today. And finally, just to add a bit more complexity to this, and this applies to every EIA project now, the 2017 regulations now introduce the requirement to consider health. So that means when we do an environmental statement of an airport and all the things that go with it, we've got to consider the health effects as well as part of the ES. And given where we are with our ability to consider health and noise, and particularly in the field of aviation, there's a lot of sensitivities around that, there's a lot of different approaches, and potentially a lot of work. Range of regulatory and consenting routes for airport infrastructure. If you're in a good place, you might be able to do it through the Town and Country Planning Act. That means submitting a planning application to the local authority in the same way as you would for your single-storey extension. But that introduces, as we found with significant infrastructure, the potential for adversarial consenting approaches through the planning system. And one good example of that is Terminal 5, Heathrow. And because of that, the government actually brought through a development consent order, which is an amendment to the Planning Act 2008, which recognises developments that are nationally significant and attempts to take away that dealing direct with the local authority. We also have the airspace change process when it comes to airports. So development consent order, that's what Heathrow will have to go through to get its third runway, a DCO, in the same way Thames Tideway Tunnel had to go through to get a DCO for its activities. The difference with an airport is that we can get the DCO for the ground infrastructure. But what the DCO can't do is replicate or duplicate or supersede or replace any other consenting process that's out there. So when it comes to the airspace change, it can't make decisions on airspace. So all it can get is the ground infrastructure consent, and an airspace change process has to come through and follow that. And when it comes to airports, we really do need to consider this, the ICAO balanced approach. That governs pretty much everything we do when it comes to aviation. So just an example for new runway consenting process, just as I said, what we end up doing is more or less 3 steps, very, very simplified in terms of what actually happens. What we have to do is define the requirement, just like any development, we have to define the need. And for a third runway at Heathrow, that was done by the Airports Commission, led by Howard Davies, and he went off and looked at all the various options out there for airport expansion in the southeast and ultimately recommended Heathrow. That was then brought forward into the airport's national policy statement, which is currently in draft. And then also, let's not forget that it's not just an Airports Commission that would define whether there's a need for an airport infrastructure. There is another active DCO airport out there at the moment, which is the reopening of Manston Airport in the south east of England, near Ramsgate. That airport is being brought forward through development consent because they've already identified a need for freight movements from overseas, which is actually exacerbated by things like Brexit, because if you want to bypass the customs union, build a big airport that allows you to bring loads of freight in directly into the country. Potentially. So it's not just about what government commission schemes come up with. Promoters can promote these things themselves, and indeed other airports will be looking with interest about how they can demonstrate need and how they can go through various mechanisms such as providing evidence in and registering development consent applications through that. As I mentioned, DCO only consents to the ground infrastructure, but it's very clear what we need to do for that. We have to have an environmental impact assessment, we have to be fully compliant with all of that, we've got to scope it, we've got to screen it, we've got to scope it, we've got to provide preliminary environmental information during that process as well, we've got to provide the full ES, we've got to go out for consultation engagement on that as well, so we've got to keep the public informed about what the effects might be. We've got to look at things like Land Compensation Act and claims. Could people be materially affected by what it is we're doing? And then we've got to go through an examination, and then ultimately there will be a Secretary of State approval and consent through that. Now again, that only gives us up to the point at which we have the ground consents. We need the airspace consents as well. And that's actually done by the Civil Aviation Authority under the Transport Act. And they have their own environmental assessment requirements. So all of a sudden, we've got this thing that in the current approach comes after the ground infrastructure, but it's got its own environmental assessment requirements. You need further rounds of consultation, you still need regulator approval to do your airspace change, and you still need Secretary of State consent too. So basically, at DCO, all we've got is that. And somehow, we don't know what's going to happen after that. But we do, but we don't. It's difficult. So this is what's currently happening. So this is the challenge, the airspace challenge. The challenge that's happening basically because we haven't built any runways in the UK for a long time. DCO, airspace change. The common requirements of all of these are, in terms of noise, the noise policy tests, so that in England is the MPSE, both what is needed under the airspace change process and in the draft CAP 1520 document, which is their environmental assessment approach, is compliance with the MPSE. So that should be pretty well known by everybody here, but that's avoid significant adverse effects on health and quality of life, mitigate and reduce where possible, and finally improve where it's possible. Those three policy tests are consistent in both what is required in both the DCO and the airspace change. We need to know about noise and health outcomes. The airspace change process talks about health in the terms of monetised outcomes, and likewise the DCO talks about health in terms of what's needed for the EIA. The airspace design guidance and policy, well, we need to design the airspace in a way where policy is telling us kind of how we should do it. What does policy say, but also what does the consultation say? Policy is very clear on this. You should consult with people. The guidance is very clear. You should consult with people. You need to understand what people think should happen when it comes to things like the design of flight paths. And then finally, all of this needs to be done, again, under the ICAO balanced approach. What ultimately this means is that in terms of airspace design, you've got to start before the DCO. Because where you put the runway will affect how you can design the airspace. Things like displaced thresholds, which mean that the aircraft land further up the runway, will affect the airspace design. And if those are things that you're only consenting on the ground, then you need to know that pretty early to influence what happens in the air. So these are things that, two separate consenting process, but actually we do need to design the airport right from the start as if it's one entity. And one way of getting around the environmental assessment requirements is bringing the ACP, environmental assessment requirements, into the DCO. So what does the airspace change process require of us in terms of environmental assessment, and should we do that in the DCO so it's consistent? And this is what it says in terms of noise. So this document, these two documents are still very draft. In February this year, we had quite a significant change in government aviation policy. We finally said goodbye to the 57 dB LAQ in a kind of roundabout way. Policy basically said that we need to be consistent with the noise policy statement for England, and therefore we need to move to LOLs and SOLs. We need to go into that way of thinking. But actually, if we had 57 onset of significant community noise, it'd be now about 54. It was kind of a roundabout way. Still in draft, but that's what they say. And that was now reflected in the CA's draft airspace design guidance. And what it says is, if you're going to do any assessment work and we're going to make decisions on that, we need you to produce these metrics. So up at the top, we've got average mode LAQ. The CA found in their SONA 14 work that was still the best metric tallying with community annoyance, and the LAQ has withstand that. But what they're saying is that 51 dB is an appropriate lull in terms of the MPSE, and that's what will be adopted for decision-making purposes in the airspace change process. One little nuance with that is that when you read the evidence that backed the CA's view on that, it only actually goes down to 51 in the noise exposure information that they considered in the analysis. So you're kind of thinking to yourself, well, could lull be lower than 51? Who knows? 63 and 69 are the thresholds that the airspace policy discusses around insulation requirements, expectations on airport operators, and then likewise on relocation at 69. And we also have a nighttime lull of 45 dB, which isn't the same as the lulls that have been used on other infrastructure projects. I'm looking at HS2 over there, where we've got, 50 dB LAQ day and a 40 dB night. So these could be challenged potentially. Who knows? We're waiting. These are only draft suggestions at the moment. And then N above metrics, these are the number of aircraft events above these levels. So these are used quite successfully around airports in communicating what is actually happening with noise events. People like to see the number of times they're affected by noise. And they've got a 65 dBLA max day and a 60 dBLA max night. And again, that's part of their airspace policy, and the CA say they use that information to assist decision making. And then finally, we've got WebTag, where various metrics are used in that to effectively monetize health effects and come up with what we think or what we believe to be the various costs of noise in terms of health outcomes from airspace design options. One other thing that's not in there is overflight. A lot of people say, well, I'm overflown. The CA have, in the latest guidance, put in a definition of overflight, which is based on the angle at which you observe an aircraft event, up to 7,000 feet. So what does this mean? So if we start with our little view here, and we just consider a single runway, and we're before any sort of development consent, and we basically got a blank canvas. Have we got any existing exposure? Well, let's assume this is why the airport didn't exist. What we do right now is say, well, how do you think you should be affected by noise from aircraft? We're not going to tell you where the flight paths could be. We're not going to tell you where they could go. We're not going to tell you anything about that. All we're going to say is, how do you think you should be affected by noise? And if you read the airspace policy from February, it gives these diagrams. It talks about, well, you could do that, you could do this, you could do this. You've got to give people options, and there's some examples in there around, well, do you want to fly over open space? Do you want us to fly over communities? Do you want us to give you 50% of the aircraft and the community near you the other 50%? At night, do you want us to overfly the houses or the open space? During the day, do you want us to fly over the houses or the open space? And you're giving people options. What you're doing is, without any prejudice, without them getting emotional about, that's my house, that's a flight path, which is where a lot of the controversies come in recent years, you're just getting that information through the consultation. Then what happens is it goes off to the airspace designers. And here's our runway, here's a departure route, and this big yellow splodge is what we call a technical design envelope, an area, or a swathe. That little purple thing up there, that's the national airspace. That's what they call a letterbox in the business. We've got to get the aircraft out the local airspace and put it into national airspace for it to go to its destination. And what happens between the runway and there is all about how the aircraft perform, how they navigate, how they produce noise on the ground. But technically, we can put a route or routes anywhere in that yellow area. But what we can't do, potentially, is say exactly where it's going to be, because that's going to be subject to a consenting process in the form of the airspace change. And that's recognised by the development consent order for Heathrow and in the national policy statement, which says that at the stage of DCO, we can only do assessments based on indicative flight paths. And that's the reason why, because there's a whole series of additional consenting processes that lead us to getting those flight paths in place, understood where they're going to be and how they're going to be flown. So we can say there's routes possible in that. And that leads us to look at, well, what are those indicative flight paths? Now, if there's different principles for how we can design those flight paths, we can present those as options as part of an assessment. We can say, well, here's one that's going to overfly every house, or the most houses we can possibly make it overfly. Here's one that prioritises flying over the open spaces. Here's one, or a combination of, that potentially give respite to the people who live within that design envelope. So if they decide that they could be overflown, but actually if they're overflown they want a break from it, we could do two, or potentially design two flight paths in that envelope. What becomes complicated is when, if that's just what's happening for one route, off one runway, if we've got 2 runways, 3 runways, 5 different envelopes off all of those routes, we could end up with a spaghetti soup. And that's where the noise assessment work for airspace in this process is going to get interesting. So let's just assume that we've got a range of outcomes from our DCO and a range of assessments, all according to the CAP 1520 metrics. We could end up with something like this. This is the end of the airspace change process, where we end up with 2 preferred routes. This is through several rounds of consultation, people saying we wouldn't mind if you design the routes like this. and the favour of consultation is that's the way it's going to work out. These will be submitted to the CAA, they'll assess them, they do their own assessment, and then they will grant approval for one of them, one or the other. And the sponsor, that could be the airport, can state a preference on which one they think should be given approval. So, summing up on all that, noise assessment work for airport infrastructure planning is complex. It is very complex. Lots of sources, lots of different considerations, different consenting regimes, assessment requirements, processes that have to be followed, and then subject to a range of consenting, assessment, guidance approaches. There we go.
Thanks, James. Interesting stuff. Anyone got any quick questions for James? There will be a Q&A session at the end, so that we can address them there. Anything? Okay, we'll move straight on to our next speaker then. Link. Okay, so Ian Holmes emailed me. Event went live and said, please,
that was
could
a moment of madness.
So as soon as we published the event on the website, Ian emailed me within 24 hours and said, I'd have to do a piece. And I was very thankful. We were going to ask you actually, but you're too busy. So I'll let you crack on with your...
Okay, so thanks. A lot of the other presentations have been very interesting, very detailed acoustic stuff. Did spend quite a few years as a noise consultant, working on roads and rail and that sort of thing. But since I've moved to Highways England about 3 years ago, I have to confess I haven't really done any noise modelling. I definitely haven't done any noise monitoring, and I definitely don't miss that. So I quite like Graham's trip to France to watch trains, but I wasn't envious of your tunnel, that was for sure. So as an organisation, safety is our number one priority. So I thought I'd start with a quick safety moment that applies to everybody that drives, and just to check your tyres. We get 40,000 tyre-related incidents on our network every year. So this is quite a good way just to check your tyres. I did this at school. My son's school, and all the other parents been moaning at me. Their kids are sticking 3Ps in their tyres when the cars are on the drive. So what I want to talk about is James has been talking about sort of detailed assessments of airports, and we've talked about HS2 and other infrastructure. But before we get to that assessment period, that assessment of a project, we need to work out what that project is going to be. From when we were the Highways Agency, I think that we were DFT did a lot of the early work and would tell us where to do a project, and we would probably come into it late in the option phase or the development stage. But now we're increasingly asked to look at it from perhaps even before the option stage, and rather than providing something to identify a proposed solution, we have to identify what the problem is, and noise and other environmental issues can feed into that, right, as well as all the traditional traffic jams and safety things that we do. So we basically go through options to solve the problem, then look at how we develop it, and through the development stage, after we've got all the consents, go through to construction. So we use the project control, it should be the project control framework rather than product on the top, and with a number of different stages. And those of you that are in our supply chain will be very familiar to this. With this network, they'll have a similar one, which I think is called GRIP. I'm not sure whether the airports have the same as well. So each of these stages is a project can only be in one of these stages, and there's a review after each one to go through to the next stage. So we're halfway through the first roads investment strategy, which was launched when Highways England launched as well, which was in April 2015, and that runs 2020. Now we're starting to look at the project that might be in RIS 2, which starts in 2020 and run to 2025. So we're looking at where might be noise problems, other problems on our network, and assessing whether those, trying to find where those areas are, so we can put projects in to solve them. That's quite an easy thing to say, but when we've got a network that's 3,500 miles long, we're not going to easily be able to calculate noise levels at every property and look at different tweaks and things for so many products. So when we do look at a problem, we go into option identification. So this might be a number of routes through a corridor, and it might be quite a lot. I've got a couple of examples later on. And then we narrow that down in stage 2 to a preferred route, and then stage 3 and 4 is where we do the sort of EIA and the DMRB assessment. And before that, we just need to think about the questions that our project sponsors and that we're looking to answer. Well, we do consult on these, but phase 0, 1 and 2 are largely internal, working out what we think the best solution is. So that's just a bit more detail about the sort of decisions we make. So when we're looking at options for public consultation, might be some options which just won't work from a noise point of view, and we don't need a detailed assessment to know that if we put a motorway 20 metres from the back of a road properties, we're going to get big noise impacts, and that's probably not a very good option. That's probably quite an extreme example, but we do that for all of the subjects, so we can pull out which options have got potential and go out to public consultation to get the information that we need about those. We narrow that down in option 2. We might do more detailed work. So sometimes noise modelling and detail might be appropriate at that stage. There's big differences between the options, but other times if the options are very, very similar or there aren't any receptors nearby, it's something that we might necessarily need to do, and we just do a qualitative assessment. So with the stages, we find that as we go through the process, we get an increase in the quality of data, not necessarily an increase in the quantity of data. So the main source of data for our assessments is the traffic models. It's really important to remember for traffic models, and probably for other infrastructure as well, that those models aren't done for noise as much as we would like them to. They're done to look at the economics. So they're not necessarily accurate, especially at the early stages. I'll hesitate to say back of the envelope, but I think sometimes a lot of faith put in those traffic models, and they're not questioned when people put into noise models. So we've had occasions when traffic data has been put into noise models without any question, pulled up some very strange results, and that they've been taken as gospel. And it's really important to think about what the quality of the data is. And also, as we go through the process, we need to increase the level of increasing level of certainty. So, for example, at stage 2, when we're looking at options, we don't necessarily need to know the noise level at every house, but we might be interested to see what the comparison is between one option and another option. So, we need a noise model. We've tried to myself and Andy, my colleague over there, we tried to put some guidance on when we did a noise model. It became really complicated really quickly, and there was no sort of sensible guidelines we could put together, because it just depends on every project. So we try and put that back to the people that know more about the projects than us, and they're the consultants that have been working on the project through the stages and paying for their professional opinion, and take into account the questions that the project sponsors need to ask answer at that time. So, for example, the project sponsors will need to go to our board and our decision makers with a project and demonstrate that that scheme is a viable solution, or whether it's not a viable solution. When we're going from the development to when we're going in the later stages, obviously the consequences of that being wrong are much higher than they are at the early stages when we've still got options to change things. Sometimes the web process forces people down, or appears to force people down the noise modelling route, because web asks for valuations, but we can do that qualitatively if you know that there's not significant differences between two options. For example, they go very close to the same amount of houses, and it's just a tweak in a route. You know that the noise valuation for that is going to be pretty much the same for each option. So there's no point in doing a detailed noise model, especially if the traffic model is still to be refined at a later date, and we're going to have to do it all again anyway. So as an example of a project, it looks a bit like the Isle of Wight, but it isn't. This is Stonehenge. We saw a picture before. So the picture in the top right, it's not a sort of true option assessment, but I found it in the consultation brochure. And that's all the routes that have been proposed over the last 25 years to solve the problem of the A303 past Stonehenge. So when this work was done, which I know somebody would be really familiar with, we looked at all those again, and then took that down in the later stage to a couple of route corridor options. There's no way we could have modelled all of those routes again. So it's looking at taking sort of sensible decisions on the World Heritage Site is the red dashed area, where we went round it, or whether we tunnel under the whole thing, or just a tunnel under the main Stonehenge monument. That was refined down in option 1 to two route corridors, so which are shown on the map there. And then, as we got to the end of stage 2, we had two options. So we had the option which we've announced, which is the tunnel option, and to the north of Winterbourne Stoke, and then we had another option which was quite a lengthy bypass to the south of the World Heritage Area, so we didn't impinge on the World Heritage Site at all. So when we did stage 2 for this, I believe we did some noise modelling, because the difference between those options is quite significant. There's lots of, I'm not sure how they come up, but there's the town of Amesbury and Winterbourne Stoke itself. So we've got the exposure for people is quite a lot different between the two routes, and also the exposure on the World Heritage Site too. And then here's an example where possibly we don't need to do a lot of noise modelling between in early stages. This is a junction improvement on the A19. And the options which are in the bottom right hand corner, I think the only changes are just the location of a slip road and the number of slip roads. There's only one house which I think is here, and the options are really similar. So without doing any modelling, you could say both options are the same. There's no big risks to that, or if there are risks to noise, they're going to be present for both options, so it shouldn't really have a bearing on the overall decision about what we go for. So that's a sort of very short sort of picture of what we try and do at the early stages, and I hope it sort of explains that we don't always need a very detailed assessment, as interesting as they are sometimes. And if anyone has any questions, then feel free.
Panel discussion later on.
Oh, sorry, what was that? The Stonehenge. Yeah, yeah. So it's called, if you look for project control framework, I think there's I think it's all sorted out. Probably not so much for noise, but basically the process that we go through. That's very clearly set out.
Any other questions for you? Okay, slightly. Thanks very much again for your interest. Okay, appreciate that. Awesome. Thank you very much. That's great. Yeah. Okay, just give us a couple of minutes. We're just going to try and get the video link to Southampton actually working. I think it is. We'll be swimming to them. While that's going on, Pete, can I just get you to stand over here and
Yeah, it's fine.
put that in your pocket and then clip this on?
Behind time? What?
No, we're just caught up miraculously.
okay.
Ahead of time.
I texted them
wow.
saying that we're running late.
Oh, right. Okay.
We're on time.
And they're on time. Right.
So I think they've got
That's
that.
good.
In fact, if you want a comfort break for 5 minutes, now might be a good time just while we're establishing this link. It's very official. Okay, now we'll do it basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll wait till they finish their
Oh, right.
are they
Right.
viewing us? Yeah, they're
What
viewing
they
us.
told us they can just see you on your
Yes. Yeah. There we go. Yep, that's fine. That's
Good.
fine.
So you're going to stand there.
Do you want me to stay here? I can.
You can move about. That's fine. But you want them to hear you. This is the microphone.
I may as well stay here then.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm happy to come over here.
Yeah.
It's much better. I can have your little space bar.
Okay.
If you want. I'm quite good at pushing the space bar, as you know by now.
Actually, is there a computer?
There is a computer.
I've got a little.
Yeah, do you want to grab it?
Yeah, I'll
Got
grab it.
one.
Yeah. Sorry. Unhitch.
No problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's asking us to stall, which is absolutely fine.
Yeah, we are still in. Are you in touch with them as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I've only just got back in touch with him now because.
Yeah, my phone's going to die as well. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I was doing some like thermal tests and I was like, no, nothing was going right.
Is it that PC there?
That's the
Yes,
one.
yeah, just
Just going to remind you also to make sure that you do sign forms before you leave on this table here.
in regards to their talk.
Yeah, put it in. Ian's presentation is
Lovely.
Yeah.
Go for
I'm all right. So, speaker. So, yeah.
They've got
So
us on.
they'll be there.
So I'm going to enjoy that basically. As long as we're not on mute, that's fine.
Yeah, fantastic.
So
yeah.
when we share
ready to
screens, where's that? It's here, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we just click on that and then we're live with our presentation.
go? Share screen.
Cool. Do I use software actually?
I'll be able to see. Can they see the
you
slides?
And they will see the slides. Like
Oh, right, as well. Okay, cool. That's pretty cool.
So
Right, nice one.
should work.
Good.
We had it running all morning downstairs, so the beginning went in there. I think one person went in there for a few minutes. We were showing all their presentation downstairs.
Oh, right.
Forget everyone wanted to be in here. Slightly more.
That's where everyone else is, basically. Yeah.
Nice one. Yeah. I wonder what they're talking about. Can we stream off it?
They need to unmute that
There's their
microphone.
reverberation
Yeah,
inaccuracies through absorption cost.
That's actually really interesting.
Yeah,
as well.
it's really interesting. The one that we want to see.
Damn.
We
sugar speakers, more sense of approach.
Yeah. Oh well.
That's different.
Really, this is an opportunity for bad lip reading. So it could be saying something completely different, like, oh, you know, I don't know, it's you do you, mine do you, but still.
Yep. You're going to be over here somewhere, aren't you?
Yep, that'll do.
Yeah.
Is it like a $6.99 from like there? About. It's got a budget laser pointer.
Well, you're not going to take down any aircraft. You know when you get up to on the weekend.
Totally.
It's been good. It's good talks, like.
Yeah?
Quite mixed. Like,
Which is your favourite?
I like Graham's.
Yeah.
Talks put into one of these. It's quite fast. It's obviously a lot more time actually.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
People want to be interesting, but I think 20-25 minutes probably too short to get into these subjects.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Some of them out, really.
Okay.
But Ian's interesting as well. James Trow is so relevant to me. I mean, no one's ever explained those things to me before.
Oh yeah,
You know
exactly.
what I
It's
mean?
stuff that just never gets explained. Like,
and you just kind of slowly get a couple of acronyms over
Yeah.
years. That.
Yeah,
I'm going to send it to everyone who I'm working with on Hebrew and say, just take 10 minutes to watch this, guys.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It takes people up in a title.
Don't bring it up yet.
How long did it take? Like 10 seconds?
Yeah, sure.
I was playing the memorable title game.
Time's less slightly, but not that bad. Okay, yeah, I think
We're slightly ahead.
you're basically there now, sorry. So that hasn't been updated.
Cool.
We're doing a thing. Put it back somehow.
25 minutes. Right, so where can I keep an eye on my time? There, fine, that'll do.
It looks like he's finished now, isn't it?
Yeah? Yeah.
Shall I ring him up?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm really tired, okay? I'm normally suffering from exhaustion.
Are you?
I've done like 3 jobs today. So we're the commercial test labs here.
Oh, yeah,
So I've
okay,
been like
alright.
running back and forth, doing testing, sorting this out, doing testing, sorting this.
Yeah, okay.
I do like thermal tests as well, so if I do
Oh,
those,
right.
I'm just I can see him.
Is this doing much?
That's for that laptop.
Oh, I see.
Okay, you
Right,
press
okay.
share screen, please, Al.
Yes.
Yeah, share now. So hopefully you'll be able to see myself.
So yeah, F5 that now.
Presentation.
Cool.
Check. Are they seeing this?
If you stand by there and just see the
I don't know if they're seeing this. Don't know if they're seeing this.
Experiment is like, you know, can you ever create a presentation where people will remember the title?
Yeah.
Is it possible?
Have we got this their feed off?
Was it called what?
Hello, Dan. Hi, this is Adam in Salford. I'm good. We can hear you guys. And are you ready for us to start our next presentation? Are we going to go live? We. Oh, great.
Wait.
We can see you on
Yeah, I can
screen.
see you.
Yes. Wow, it's a Eurovision moment.
Okay. Right.
Okay, so I think we're ready to start the next talk, and we've got a live link with Southampton, so it's proper Eurovision style today. And I guess I'll do the introduction, and if you guys put your mic on mute at the end, we'll hopefully have some questions. Okay? Thanks, Dan. Okay, without further ado then, I give you Peter Mumford, a colleague of Peter's at ARAP. He worked on HS2 for
6
years,
I think,
nearly,
something like that.
nearly
Yeah.
full time through ARAP, so
Yeah.
I think you're going to be working on it for some time to come.
Yeah, till 2040.
All the way through. Okay. And I will let you carry
Yeah,
on
sure.
with your introduction then.
Thank you. Hello, yep, so Peter Mumford from ARAP. Yes, as I say, you've been working on HS2 for around 6 years. The problem with HS2, it's such a big project. So just keep doing more and more and more of it. So I have kind of entered the memorable title competition. We'll see if that gets changed before the official notes go out. We'll see. So on HS2, in the past I've done noise modelling, assessment, mitigation design, ES writing, coordination, all kinds of things. So this was going to be a presentation about significant effects and so on, but as it turns out, Pam Lowery, whose presentation is after mine, is going to go into more of that. So I'm going to leave a lot of that to Pam. So I ended up writing a presentation about a couple of the technical aspects that we find in high-speed rail noise. So there. And first off, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the project itself. So I'll try not to spend too much time on that. So here is the project. London, Birmingham, and the Manchester and Leeds and so on. So the dark blue is called Phase 1. That's London to Birmingham. That's got its plan approval. It's got the Queen's signature on its Act of Parliament. So they're going ahead and getting started with the design and build contracts for that. And I guess the only thing that could scupper that is some significant problem with public finances. So let's see if that happens or not. Then the mid blue, we have Phase 2A, which is essentially an extension of Phase 1. That'll open very, very shortly after Phase 1, possibly even at the same time. Maybe when it opens, you'll be able to get a train from Crewe to London that's high speed. So, but focusing in on the north, because I thought I was going to just present to Manchester. We have Southampton as well. Hello. So sorry about this slide. Ignore this one. But this is the most interesting bit bit of project, really, northern bit. Hopefully it'll get built. Because you see the project, to me it's a Birmingham-centric project. All the good connections Birmingham gets, it gets massive improvement in journey time to all of these northern destinations. And what's exciting is the Chancellor recently announced that they're going to, well, for now, they're committing funding to trying to use HS2 in combination with other proposed big rail schemes for the north, like Northern Powerhouse Rail, East Midlands Connector, Crew Hub, in order to make full use of the railway tracks that they'll be building as part of HS2. So, little possibilities are Northern Powerhouse Rail, their main Trans-Pennine route could be this one, Manchester to Leeds, could be that one, Manchester to Sheffield. I don't think they decided yet, but either way it could tie in HS2 tracks. Also, Northern Powerhouse Rail would be going Liverpool, Manchester. It's basically this west-east corridor. So from Liverpool through to Manchester, it could make use of some of the HS2 tracks as well, and then going on to Hull, the same thing. Crew, the Crew Hub proposal is to build a junction so that you can get trains, for example, going from the north and to be able to turn off into Crew Station, and that means they'll be able to go off in all the kind of directions that Crew offers. So it's making HS2 part of the existing rail network. It's integrating it much more closely. So that's what's going on in the project. If it all goes to plan, hopefully it means a huge amount of infrastructure work in North over the next 15 years. Okay, so I'm going to talk about tunnel portal noise, and then I'm going to talk about train noise, so airborne noise from trains, overlapping slightly with Graham's earlier presentation. So, tunnel portal noise. Okay, so if we paint a picture, so let's take you to the countryside, the rural countryside of England. We have a nice cottage, someone's in their kitchen, they're about to sit down and enjoy a nice cup of tea. And then intruding on this, they hear a distant thump, and their nice teapot that their gran gave them starts to rattle around, their windows rattle, and so on. So this is the fear, this is the concern of a lot of the residents that we talk to on HS2 up and down who might be living near tunnel portals. So this is what they fear. So essentially what they're fearing is effects on health and quality of life. So in this case from what is called, they call portal boom or tunnel boom. I've heard it referred to. So effects on health and quality of life, Pam will expand on later on. Okay, so what is this effect that they're talking about, this potential effect? So it's down to micro pressure waves, and these are caused by the kind of cork in a bottle effect, train going into a tunnel, which creates a build of pressure in front of the train, which then propagates along the tunnel at the speed of sound, and can then, when it comes at the other end, if it's not mitigated properly, it can produce those effects that I've talked about, either audible, an audible effect, or a pressure pulse, a pressure wave that can rattle windows and things like that. So I'm not going to talk about the physics of this, the complex physics. I mean, that you have mathematical equations, solutions that go all the way from a 1D approach, just as the tunnel is one long thing, to a 2D approach, to people using supercomputers to do fluid dynamics on these kind of problems. Okay, so, but in practical terms, we're going to talk about how can you mitigate this? How can you prevent it from being a problem? So there's three potential factors tunnel design, train design, and portal design. Okay. So, essentially what all of these do is try and smooth the transition of the train into the tunnel. So that reduces the gradient of the pressure wave, so it's less abrupt. That's what all of these solutions do. Okay, so tunnels first of all. So so this is a London Underground tunnel, and you can see the train takes up virtually the entire cross section of tunnel. Now that's fine because that runs at a very, very low speed. So, but as you get faster and faster, you need a wider tunnel. You need more of the cross-section area kept free in order to for aerodynamic reasons, and for high-speed rail for these portal boom problems. So on HS2, the kind of diameters they're talking about for the bored tunnels for the really fast tunnels are something pretty enormous. So that is a 9 meter wide bored tunnel, which has been built in the northwest of England recently to accommodate 2 classic rail tracks. So on HS2, that kind of scale of tunnel, about 8.5 meter diameter, would accommodate 1 track each way. So these things are huge. And largely that's driven by aerodynamic considerations. It's going so fast you need a very big tunnel. Okay. Now, what if you are somewhere where you don't have a large tunnel? So Japan, for example, another country I can't remember right now, but what the situation they were in is they built a network including bored tunnels decades ago, designed for a lower speed, and then they wanted to basically increase the speed of trains running through those tunnels. And this is the first places that actually experience portal boom. You know, there are some recordings on the internet you can find. So if you're in that position, you end up with extraordinary trains that look like this, these massively long noses, and essentially these are designed to smooth transition into the tunnel. Now, you're not going to see something like this on HS2, even though it looks really cool, because they're going to use tunnel design and the portal design to eradicate the problem first off. Okay. So there we go. So the third one is a portal design. And we refer to these as porous portals because essentially they smooth the transition in 2 ways: by gradually changing the cross-sectional area, and also basically building a conda around your portal, so putting holes in it to smooth that transition. Now, on HS2, for the fast tunnels, you're getting porous portal lengths of about 150 meters included in the design, the preliminary design that gets planning permission. That's huge. I mean, that's a long thing, but when you're going at 360 kilometers an hour, that's a second and a half of your journey time. So, just to illustrate these concepts, this is something that I stole, nicked, borrowed. That's it. So I borrowed the slides from someone else. So there we go. You can see one of these portals that's going into a hill. If that tunnel is about 9 meters, then you need to leave at least a tunnel diameter between the 2 tunnels so they don't collapse. So that creates a very wide rail corridor. So if you have that, then this is what you look at. You look at gradually changing the cross-sectional area in advance of tunnel I, and also putting vents on top to provide this kind of porosity. And then if you get it right, then you could maybe restore it and turf it over and make it look quite nice in the end. So that was tunnel portal noise. I mean, it's an interesting area, but one that hopefully you'll never hear or never experience, because it will be completely designed out by mitigation. So one that you probably will be left with some impacts and effects is airborne noise. So you're into essentially minimising as much as you can. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the train sources. And so if we start, if we think about where Japan was, so Japan started its Shinkansen trains in the 60s. That's one. The speed of the trains on the network was increasing. We were getting a lot of complaints about noise and vibration into these train lines. So essentially they had to work out, how do you increase speed whilst not increasing noise and vibration. So that was the question they had to cover. So on a high-speed train, what kind of noise sources do you get? So slight overlaps with Graham's presentations earlier. So the big red line, this is over time, level over time as the train passes. The big red line is the total. The blue line is rolling noise. So you can see rolling noise is still the kind of, probably still the largest contributor to noise. But just below it, you got the purple line, the body aerodynamic noise, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then if you've got your pantographs and the wells where they're stationed on the top of the train, that's what you see on the bottom. So what are the relationships with velocity? Well, again, the thick red line is the total noise coming off the train. The rolling noise is labelled there, but you'll see that the aerodynamic noises, lower speeds, they're virtually indistinguishable, but as you get up into the kind of, high 200s and 300s in terms of kilometres an hour, that's when they start to become noticeable. So that's where we start to say this is a high-speed railway line in noise terms. Looking at the train from the side, so we've got rolling noise, which is a lot of that red stuff that you can see, and then we have aerodynamic sources as well. So a lot of that aerodynamic stuff comes from the nose of the train, so this is the first thing to hit the air, and the undercarriage essentially can be quite a key source of that as well. You can see between the carriages, between the cars, there's bits of aerodynamic noise as well. Now, if you put a noise barrier in there, then it's going to be more effective for the lower sources, but it's going to be less effective for the upper sources. So control of noise at source becomes important, especially for the aerodynamic sources. Okay, so a quick one on rolling noise. It's still important. It's low down, which is good from a barrier control point of view. We talked briefly about slab track before. There may be a lot of slab track on HS2, we've yet to see. It does increase noise slightly, basically because if you have a ballast track, then that ballast provides some of the give that's necessary to absorb the kind of bumps from the train. If you've got slab track, then all of that needs to be provided by the rail clips, by the rail fastenings. So they need to be slightly softer than they would be if it was on ballast track. That means more of the energy created by the rolling stays in the rail. So if more energy stays in the rail, then more of that will radiate out as airborne noise. So options to reduce that. So roughness control of wheel rails, very, very important. You can have articulated bogies like the old Eurostyles used to, which basically where carriages share wheels, so you have fewer wheels. You can have damped wheels. And final one, extremely unpopular with track engineers, is rail dampers. So you're basically clagging on a tuned absorber to your rails to take out that energy, reduce that ringing from the rails. Then we move, so we're going back to Japan now. So talked about their challenges of increasing speed while not increasing noise. So this is a kind of pin-up train mitigation. We don't actually have any posters of this in our offices, just to clarify. But it demonstrates a lot of the really good features that you'd want in your dream train from an acoustic point of view. Low noise pantograph, we'll come on to that in a bit. From the aerodynamic noise, you just notice that the train is extremely smooth. So every little bit, they've looked at the doors, between the carriages, they've tried to make that as smooth as possible. So it's a general principle. And then when it comes to the undercarriage of the train, which can be a big source of aerodynamic noise, they've actually put in shrouds around that to have smoother air, to stop the airflow from interacting with the undercarriage and the buggies and so on. The pantograph, the thing picks up power from the overhead line. There's a clear difference between, on the left is a kind of standard European type pantograph. On the right is a kind of once in service in the Far East. So you can immediately, I don't need to explain this, you can see the difference in the streamlined nature of the one on the right, which is about 10 dB quieter than the one on the left. Okay, so stuff I'm not going to talk about today, which I was going to, it's a completely different presentation, is so mitigation between the train and the houses. So that's noise barriers, the unbundling and so on. But it's just a nice picky from HS1. Okay, so that's my main point. So the one slide I wanted to get in, which was about kind of my experience on the road shows and so on, talking to people, knowing where they are in relation to the scheme, knowing how likely they are actually to be affected by the scheme. And you see a lot of people that are, they'll hardly notice the scheme at all, but they're massively scared about it and worried about it. So to me, it seems, there's a lot of the research into health and quality of life from projects. One of the big glaring ones for me is the fear of the thing before it actually gets built. And to me, that can outweigh, that seems to be much larger than some of the potential effects once it's in construction and being built. So how do we improve that? One of the problems about the work that RAS do, it's often can be dictated by the lawyers or the barristers. Now, they tend to love documents because they can defend them in front of courts, which is fantastic for them. But they're utterly impenetrable to the public, totally. So hopefully we can move forward to things called digital ESs, which someone can load up a web browser, get a map, point on their house, and then be able to experience what the scheme will be like for them. So hopefully that can be where we're going in the future. We want people to hear stuff, maybe out on the road, maybe in their own homes. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. The next one will be Pam, which will take that on, going from predicted noise to health effects. Thank you very much. Oh, there we go.
Okay, that's great. Do we have any questions? Manchester first?
Nope.
Yeah, okay, Dan, you're on.
You didn't actually say anything about the efficiency portal, and it seems to me that a pointy nose would be much cheaper than a very big diameter tunnel, so is it much less effective in Japan?
That's a great question. I must admit, I don't know is the honest answer. I know that the Japanese line speeds are obviously lower than the proposed speed for HS2, so probably it might be that maybe there's a non-linear relationship. You know, once you get up to a certain speed, you start needing much bigger engineering solutions to allow for a higher design speed. But I know there's a difference in line speeds, so maybe that accounts for it. But they have, in Japan, they've had to retrofit porous portals onto the end of their tunnels. So I know that and do the long nose trains. But I also know European manufacturers hate long noses because they make trains with short noses. So the standards which they write say that a train has to have a short nose if it's to be compliant with the European design.
Okay. Any other questions from Southampton or Salford?
Anyone else?
Cool. Okay. Okay, thanks very much then, Peter. Okay. Okay, and we're going to move straight on to Salford's last talk of the day, actually. I'll just get the tech working. Okay, Adam. The microphone's just here. Can I give you a lapel? Just
pocket.
Yeah.
Tissue there.
Thanks very much. That's perfect. The other microphone's there. So
Lovely.
Great.
Right, I'm just over here.
Last but not least, we've got Pam Lowery from ACOM. Talk about the title is on the screen.
Thank you very much, Mark. Right, can you hear me okay in Southampton? Right, okay. I'm assuming that you can then. Right, just a bit of background. I was approached about a week ago to give a presentation, and those of you who don't know my background, I spent 20 years with Highways Agency, 10 of those in acoustics before moving on to HS2, where I spent 3 years before moving to AECOM. So it was a bit of a toss-up of whether I talked about road noise or whether I talked about rail noise. And with Ian's presentation and Peter's presentation, put me in a bit of a quandary in terms of what to actually focus on. But what I decided to do, there's a little element of HS2 that's not well understood, and actually something that interests me quite a lot, which is about the health effects of high-speed rail, and particularly those on sleep. So I thought I'd give you a bit of an insight into the work that HS2 did to come up with its impact values, which were then used in the EIA and will be used throughout the project to determine significant effects. Right, so, but I wanted to give you a bit of an opening in terms of what is sleep. You know, we all sort of go to bed, go to sleep, and we think nothing of it. there's different stages of sleep which we probably don't understand what's happening or don't know what's happening, but they're actually all quite important. And they fall into two different parts. There's REM sleep, which you probably have heard of, and that's when you actually dream. That's the part where you dream. But that and also deep sleep are parts of sleep which are actually restorative. So they restore your mind, particularly REM sleep. And stage 3 is a part where your body actually restores itself in terms of muscle relaxation. So your body recovers from stresses of one day, so it gets you prepared for the next day. So, and that's actually quite important when we look at the impacts of noise, because one of the things we don't want to do is to impact that restorative sleep too much that it then causes adverse effects on health. So what we need to understand to identify if we're going to impact that or not is the sleep pattern that our body goes through and how often it goes through it and where we are susceptible to waking up. So that's why I've put this pattern in here of a typical sleep pattern. So when you first go to sleep, you go to sleep stage 1, which is a really, really light sleep. Then you progress to sleep stage 2, which is when you start preparing for deep sleep. And you go into your deep sleep, which is stage 3, and then you start to come out of that again to then REM sleep before you then fall back into the next cycle. Now these cycles, as I mentioned, as put in there, they last about 90 minutes and they get longer as the night goes on. But one important thing as well is those sleep stages aren't they're not consistent throughout the night. So for instance, you'll get more stage 3 sleep in your first part of the night, and then towards the morning you'll get more REM sleep. Another thing to actually understand is we all think, well, awakenings occur because of noise, obviously. Awakenings can occur for all sorts of reasons, and they occur naturally, and that's something we need to understand as well to identify just how much noise impacts on sleep. So I've touched on it there. Why is sleep important? And it comes back to those restorative issues. If we don't have that restorative sleep and we have all those cycles, you start to affect the body in the terms of how it can function. As I say, it can happen for all sorts of reasons. You might have noise that wakes you up. You might have temperatures that might get hot when in the summer, for instance, and you feel sort of quite hot and you have to open the windows. That can affect your sleep as well. So there's all different sorts of factors that can then wake you up, and then that has a chain reaction in terms of awakenings, and then it might then lead on to other things. So that's why sleep is important, and so therefore our understanding of how noise affects that, and from high-speed rail, how we can actually minimise that chain happening is actually important. The way I wanted to do this, as I say, is through high speed too. So I'm not going to go through the project itself because Peter did that quite succinctly. But you know, as picking up on what Peter said, there is a lot of fear with regards to the project. You've got trains going at 360 miles an hour. And even though it doesn't operate at night, there are trains operating in the nighttime hours, so we do have to take sleep effects into account. So how do we actually come up with a process or policy to make sure that the railway can actually operate, but we still take account of those health effects to a point that we're minimising the effects on people? And these have been picked up on already by James. This goes back to the overarching thing is the noise policy statement for England. That's where we actually start from, because that gives us the framework for identifying what we need to avoid, what we need to mitigate. So how low do we have to go to make sure those effects on people are minimised? And I've picked out health in blue here because that's the thing that I'll be concentrating on, and that's the thing about sleep. I don't know if you can actually see, unfortunately, I didn't choose the right colour. So just on that noise policy statement for England, we had lows and sols. So noise policy statement for England helps us in some way, but we have to look at other guidance to give us an idea of, well, what does that mean in practice? And so when, that should actually say noise, actually no, it's the National Planning Practice Guidance. It gives us a bit of an idea in terms of what behaviour we should be looking at for determining those lows and sol levels. So when we're avoiding significant impacts on health, and in this particular issue, sleep, what sort of behaviour does that mean? And for sols in particular, it's the potential for sleep disturbance resulting in difficulty for getting to sleep, premature awakening and difficulty getting back to sleep. So that means that we've got to avoid that behaviour, otherwise we start to have those health impacts and those adverse health effects from sleep that propagate through that chain. But it's not just about avoiding those significant effects. We do then have to look at, well, the effects don't just start there, the effects actually start at a lower level, but because there's behaviour before the sol level that we have to be aware of, which is the low level, which in noise policy terms we have to try and minimise to get down to. And that talks about potential for sleep disturbance. And I'll come to how that's defined in the next slide. So HS2, during the phase 1 development, which Peter was a part of, and then got transcribed into its policy for phase 1, used a whole host of research to identify what those low sol levels are. So what level should it be striving towards to make sure that those effects that I presented before don't occur, or make sure we do as much as we can so they don't occur. And they fall into two indicators. So we've got the LEQ, which people are probably a lot familiar with, particularly through the night noise guidelines for Europe, where it specifically identifies a low value of 40 decibels for an 8-hour night. So that's actually quite straightforward. So the research there, which actually gives us that value. And the sol indirectly is within night noise guidelines as well. The World Health Organization guidance, through the night noise guideline and other World Health Organization documents, are not concerned with sol. Sol is actually a noise policy statement for England concept. That's where sol comes from. It's not within World Health Organization guidelines. But we've used the wording in night noise guidelines to determine what a sol is, because it has words to the effect that 55 decibels on the LEQ is where the effects on population start to get, I'm not quite sure if it uses the word significant, but it does align with what sol in the noise planning practice guidance defines. It starts to become a big issue for populations. So we can take that as a sol, because that's the level at which it does start to become an issue. We also have LA max. Again, who does look at this indirectly? I think James brought up the issue of the 45 dB. It was a 40, yeah. So we've derived from that low outside of 60 dB in terms of LA max. But there is nothing out there that directly could point us to a sol for LA max. So we had to look a bit wider, and the next thing I'll go into is, well, how did we actually come up with values that we define as low and sol, which, as you can see, there are 80 and 85 decibels, which comes actually from research findings on adverse effects of non-restorative sleep. So going back to the issues I talked about in terms of the different sleep stages and how they were important in arriving at that soul value. I'm not going to go into these in too much detail because unfortunately there isn't time, but we had to look, we had to take quite a wide range of research to actually inform those values, because as you can imagine, there's not a lot of high-speed rail research out on quite a number of health effects to actually come up with these sorts of values. But we start with Rice and Morgan research, which is actually a synthesis of a whole load of research, predominantly on aircraft back in the early 1980s. Which looked at social surveys, it looked at laboratory measurements, it looked at a whole host of different sleep research findings using a whole range of different techniques, which actually came up with, and it actually used the word significant, and if I can just define it here, specific source of specific noise disturbance of sleep may be expected to become significant once the outdoor nighttime level, LEQ level exceeds 55, providing the max levels don't exceed 75 to 80. You can also have high values, up to 60 dB LEQ, if the number of LA max events don't exceed 85 for less than 20 events per night. So that was actually a good starting point for us in terms of building up our evidence for LA max. So then we looked further, more recently, at BASNA research. You see, I've put a dotted line between BASNA and Elmhorst because they're actually part of the same research group from German aerospace research. First of all, BASNA focused on aircraft again, and his research was developed from need to develop a noise policy strategy for Leipzig Airport. And he and his fellow researchers did quite an in-depth study around Cologne Airport. And from that they took quite a wide range of measurements again. And I can never say this word without messing up, polysomnography, which is actually taking electronic measurements of people's heart rate and what have you. So you can actually relate it back directly to those sleep stages that I mentioned, and they took internal noise levels, external noise levels. And one thing that BASNA wanted to do from that was actually identify, first of all, what was the probability of sleep disturbance for non-noise reasons, because from that you can actually derive what your noise levels would be and your probability due to noise events. So that was one important aspect of the BASNA work. And one of the from that he then derived a number of criteria for the Leipzig Airport noise policy, which was that you wouldn't have significant effects from sleep due to noise if you made sure that on average you did not get one extra awakening of noise from noise per night. So if you average it out over a year, it's 365 events over a year. So that's one to park just for a moment. Elmhorst then took that research and looked at it in terms of railways. So he looked at it in terms of passenger rail and freight, and used BASNA findings. Again, looked at different noise levels from railways and people's reaction to that, and did a similar thing and actually produced similar graphs. And then, so using a combination of the BASNA, no more than one awakening per night, and the curves that Elmhorst actually got from his research, what that resulted in, when you looked at HS2, you actually had no more than one average of one awakening per night over a year if your LA max was 80 dB outside. So it all that research, as I helped us to come up with those values, and it actually showed the Basner and Elmhorst research actually correlated quite well with the Rice and Morgan findings 20, 30 years earlier as well. So how do we mitigate that those noise levels? Well, in a very similar way to what Peter's described, and how you would mitigate other sort of LEQ levels. But the one thing I actually wanted to bring up, and something that Ian mentioned earlier on, was the use of web tags, so the valuation for cost and benefits of noise mitigation measures, which was used for HS2 to identify whether a barrier was cost effective or not. Now, web tag, in terms of its history, until 2015 it just looked at hedonic pricing, so the willingness to pay. Usefully, or in part usefully, in November 2015, and this was drawn on research done by DEFRA and DFT, we had an update to WebTag which actually brought in monetisation of health effects, which included, helpfully, sleep disturbance. Now, one of the commonalities between WebTag pre and post 2015, it was actually based on LEQ levels per day. And one of the things that helped post 2015, it actually included those for nights as well. So we could actually start cost sleep disturbance. But this was only still in terms of LEQ levels. So running out of time, I would go into Dally's, but in presentation in itself, and I'm running out of time. So if I could just skip to the next slide, actually it wasn't there. So one thing it still doesn't take into account, however, is LA max levels. That's okay if you've got a constant relationship between your LA max and your LEQ levels. One thing we found with HS2, which I think Peter will back me up on this one, you did have some instances where you provided mitigation based on LEQ levels, but you might have had gaps in barriers where you actually got quite a high LA max, and then you couldn't justify that using WebTag. And so therefore, one of the things that HS2 has been looking at is actually how to address that to make sure that LA max, and particularly for sleep disturbance, is costed and considered in its consideration of noise mitigation for LA max levels at night. And thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful. There's hardly anybody there.
Thank you, Pam. Questions? Salford? Graham?
Just a very quick one.
Yes.
We know that we can expect the World Health Organization
Okay, sorry, just a question.
We know we can expect the new World Health Organization guidance on noise to come out relatively soon, possibly the end of the year, early next year. Should they lower the levels in their guidance relating to health, do you envisage that means you might see the lowering of the low out, possibly for the stage 2 of HS2?
That's an interesting question. I can't second guess. Well, yeah, I thought it did. I can't second guess who might say or what they might say. One thing I will say, however, is those values were derived based on current guidance in terms of the WHO values. I'll take the AMAX SOL